In clinical assessments, certain individuals accurately identified emotional states in others and responded with appropriate verbal empathy, while showing reduced physiological markers of emotional engagement. Their responses were correct, but internally unaccompanied. What does it mean when empathy is present in behavior, but absent in experience? There is a clinical pattern observed in high-functioning individuals assessed for psychopathic traits. They can accurately identify emotions in others, describe them in detail, and respond with behavior that appears empathetic, without showing corresponding physiological markers of emotional engagement. In controlled settings, their language mirrors concern, their tone conveys warmth, and their timing aligns with what empathy should look like. Yet, measures such as galvanic skin response and neural activity suggest something absent beneath the surface. If empathy can be performed convincingly without being felt, what exactly are you responding to when someone appears to understand you? Psychologists differentiate between two forms of empathy: affective empathy, the capacity to feel what another person feels, and cognitive empathy, the ability to understand and predict another person's emotional state. The concept at the center of this analysis is controlled empathy, the deliberate use of cognitive empathy to simulate emotional connection, often without effective involvement. This distinction is not theoretical. It appears in research on the dark triad, particularly psychopathy, where individuals demonstrate intact or even heightened cognitive empathy paired with reduced emotional resonance. Paul Ekman's work on emotional expression showed that facial cues can be learned, replicated, and deployed with precision. Combined with Robert Cialdini's principles of influence, specifically liking and reciprocity, this creates a framework where emotional signals can be engineered rather than experienced. By the end of this, you will begin to separate genuine emotional alignment from its simulation, not by guessing intention, but by identifying structural inconsistencies in how empathy is expressed. In observational studies of interpersonal manipulation, a consistent pattern emerges. The individual mirrors emotional language with high accuracy. If someone expresses frustration, the response is calibrated: acknowledgement, validation, reassurance. I understand why that would frustrate you. That must have been difficult. The structure is correct. The timing is appropriate. The response feels aligned. What differs is the internal process. Simulated empathy is not spontaneous. It is constructed through pattern recognition and prediction. Cognitively, this relies on theory of mind, the ability to model another person's internal state. High-functioning manipulators use this capacity not to connect but to anticipate. There is no emotional contagion. Instead, there is analysis followed by execution. Detection tool: focus on emotional continuity. Genuine empathy evolves with the conversation. It adapts, deepens, sometimes hesitates. Simulated empathy often resets with each response, maintaining correctness but lacking progression. This leads to a more subtle distinction. In natural emotional exchange, responses carry variability. There are slight delays when processing complex feelings. There are moments of overlap, interruption, recalibration. Simulated empathy often appears cleaner. Responses arrive with minimal delay. Emotional language is delivered without visible effort. There is no observable cognitive strain. Authentic emotion introduces noise. Simulation minimizes it. This connects to cognitive load theory. When someone genuinely engages emotionally, multiple systems activate: memory, sensation, personal association. This creates subtle irregularities. In contrast, a purely cognitive response operates more efficiently. It retrieves a pattern and applies it. Detection tool: observe timing under complexity. When the emotional content becomes layered, conflicting feelings, ambiguity, does the response slow down and adapt? Or does it remain consistently precise? From here, the pattern becomes less about what is said and more about what is missing. Empathy, when genuine, involves vulnerability. It requires partial identification with another person's state. This introduces risk, misinterpretation, discomfort, emotional exposure. Simulated empathy avoids this. The individual remains stable regardless of the emotional intensity of the interaction. They acknowledge distress without absorbing it. They validate without revealing anything of themselves. When empathy carries no cost to the person expressing it, its authenticity becomes questionable. This aligns with research on emotional detachment in psychopathy. Reduced amygdala activation limits emotional resonance, allowing observation without internal disruption. Detection tool, track reciprocity. Does the person ever disclose their own emotional state in a way that feels unstructured or imperfect? Or is their role consistently that of the composed responder? This distinction introduces a deeper layer. In influence studies, individuals who effectively build rapport tend to identify and respond to specific emotional needs: validation, reassurance, belonging. High-functioning manipulators do the same, but with strategic intent. They do not respond broadly, they respond selectively, amplifying the signals that increase dependence or trust. Controlled empathy is not about understanding everything, it is about identifying what matters most to influence. For example, if a person seeks validation, the response emphasizes recognition. If they seek certainty, the response provides clarity. Each interaction is calibrated. This reflects principles of reinforcement learning. Responses that produce desired outcomes are repeated and refined. Detection tool. Observe consistency across contexts. Does the individual's empathy shift depending on what benefits them? Do they emphasize certain emotions when it aligns with their objectives? At this stage, the pattern appears functional, almost mechanical, but here is where it becomes more complex. The ability to simulate empathy is not exclusive to manipulative personalities. In many professional roles, medicine, law, negotiation, individuals are trained to regulate emotional expression while maintaining effective interpersonal communication. They learn to respond with empathy even when emotional involvement must remain controlled. The behavior alone does not define the intention. The same pattern can serve care or control. This creates ambiguity. A surgeon maintaining composure while expressing concern is not manipulating. A negotiator aligning emotionally to build rapport may be operating strategically, but not deceptively. What differentiates controlled empathy in manipulation is not the presence of simulation, but the absence of genuine alignment combined with consistent self-serving outcomes, which shifts the analysis from behavior to pattern over time. In behavioral analysis, intent is difficult to measure directly. Outcomes, however, are observable. When empathy is genuine, the interaction tends to produce mutual regulation. Both individuals move toward clarity or stability. When empathy is controlled for manipulation, the outcome often benefits one side disproportionately. Empathy that consistently leads to asymmetric outcomes is no longer neutral, it is instrumental. This connects to Cialdini's principle of reciprocity. When someone feels understood, they are more likely to concede, trust, or comply. A manipulator leverages this predictably. Detection tool. Evaluate after the interaction. Who gained leverage? Did the emotional exchange lead to balanced understanding or to increased influence by one party? This leads to the final structural layer. Over extended interaction, genuine empathy reveals variation. It adapts to changing contexts, sometimes failing, sometimes recalibrating. Simulated empathy maintains consistency but lacks depth. The responses remain effective, but they do not accumulate into a richer understanding. Each interaction feels complete in isolation, but disconnected from a larger emotional narrative. Depth requires internal reference. Simulation operates without it. Detection tool. Look for continuity. Does the person remember and build upon previous emotional exchanges in a way that reflects lived understanding? Or do they reapply similar patterns without integration? At this point, the structure is visible. Empathy is not a single signal. It is a system, and systems reveal themselves over time. If empathy can be simulated with this level of precision, then emotional connection becomes harder to evaluate than most assume. What feels genuine may be structurally accurate, but internally empty. This does not imply that most people are manipulative, it suggests something more precise. Human interaction relies heavily on signals that can be learned, replicated, and optimized. The mechanisms you trust to detect sincerity are not exclusive to sincerity, which introduces a more difficult reflection. If these patterns are observable in others, they are also present to varying degrees in you. Whenever you adjust your response to fit expectation rather than internal state, you engage in a mild form of controlled empathy. The difference is not existence, but degree and intent. Now that you understand the mechanism, here is what to watch for. First, track emotional continuity. Genuine empathy evolves across time. Simulation tends to reset, maintaining correctness without progression. Second, observe cost. Real emotional engagement introduces variability, pauses, imperfection, partial disclosure. When empathy appears consistently effortless, examine it more closely. Third, evaluate outcomes. After interaction, assess who gained influence. If empathy repeatedly leads to one-sided advantage, it is functioning as a tool, not a connection. And apply this inward. Notice when your responses are constructed rather than felt. That awareness is the boundary between communication and performance, because the final distinction is this: empathy is not defined by how accurately it is expressed, but by whether something real is at stake behind it. In the next layer, the question shifts from how emotion is simulated to how trust is engineered before emotion even enters the equation.